He was just a boy on a plane. A ticket in his hand. A seat waiting for him in first class. He did everything right, checked his boarding pass. Followed the rules. But none of that mattered. Because when the flight attendant looked at him, she didn't see a passenger. She saw a problem. In front of an entire cabin of silent witnesses. She forced him out of his seat. Made him walk to the back of the plane, humiliated. Dismissed. Erased. But what she didn't know. That boy wasn't just any passenger. His mother owned the entire airline. And what happened next? No one on that flight was ready for it. Before we dive into this shocking story, tell us, where are you watching from today? Drop your city in the comments. And if you love powerful stories that challenge the way we see the world, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Now, let's begin. The plane hummed with the quiet efficiency of a world moving forward. A space suspended between the earth and the sky, where everything should have felt equal. Weightless. Daniel Walker, 10 years old and full of wonder, sat in his first-class seat with his hands gripping the smooth leather armrests. His mother had kissed his forehead before he boarded, smoothing down his collar the way she always did when she was about to send him somewhere she could not follow. "Be good," she had said, "and remember, you belong anywhere you set your feet." He had held on to that. He believed it. He had to. The first-class cabin smelled of something rich and unspoken, of money. Of power. Of a world where silence was cultivated like a well-kept garden. The passengers around him sipped on pre-flight champagne, murmuring in low, controlled tones. Their suits were crisp. Their watches gleamed under the soft cabin lights. No one looked at him directly. But Daniel felt it, that almost imperceptible shift. The momentary pause when someone noticed that something in the composition was out of place. Still, he settled in, sliding his backpack beneath the seat in front of him, his fingers brushing against the boarding pass he had checked twice before sitting down. He had been so careful, so sure. He was supposed to be here. The screen in front of him flickered to life with a welcome message. He reached into his bag for his headphones, already picturing the movie he would watch before takeoff. But before he could put them on, a shadow stretched across his lap, blocking the screen. A woman stood in the aisle, her uniform pressed and her eyes sharp. Flight attendant Evelyn Harper. She wasn't young, wasn't old, but she had the air of someone who had spent years cultivating authority in a place where few questioned her. She smiled, but it was the kind of smile that never touched the eyes. "Sweetheart, are you lost?" The words dripped from her mouth like honey laced with something bitter. The kind of voice people used when they wanted to sound kind but still remind you that you were out of place. Daniel blinked, momentarily thrown off. "No," he said, his voice polite, steady. "This is my seat." She tilted her head slightly, her eyes flicking to the empty seat beside him, then back to his face. "First class is for reserved passengers only," she said, her tone shifting just enough to make the meaning clear. "Where are your parents?" A lump formed in Daniel's throat, but he forced himself to swallow it down. "I'm flying alone," he said. "I have a ticket." A flicker of something crossed her face, something quick, something unreadable. She extended her hand, palm up. "Let me see it, sweetheart." There was no refusing. He dug into his pocket, pulled out the ticket, and placed it in her waiting palm. Her eyes scanned the print, her lips pressing into a thin, bloodless line. For a moment, she hesitated. The ticket was real. He knew that. And now, so did she. But she didn't hand it back. Instead, she lowered herself slightly, her voice dropping into something lower. "Meant just for him. How did you get this ticket?" Daniel stiffened. He understood the words, but it took his mind a second longer to understand what she was really asking. "My mom bought it for me," he said, slower this time, his voice quieter. There it was again, that flicker. The mask slipping just enough to show something behind it. Something that made his stomach knot. The smile vanished completely. "Listen," she said, straightening. "I don't know what happened, but there must be some mistake. First class is reserved for our highest paying passengers. You'll need to move to the back." The words struck like a slap. But it wasn't just the words, it was how she said them. As if she had already decided, long before she asked for his ticket. As if the truth of his presence here didn't matter. "But, come on now," she said, louder this time, cutting him off. "Let's not make a scene. Gather your things, and I'll find you a seat where you belong." Where you belong. The phrase settled like a stone in Daniel's chest. His ears burned. His hands trembled as he reached for his backpack, his fingers fumbling over the zipper. Around him, the first-class passengers had gone eerily still. They weren't looking at him, at least. Not directly, but they weren't speaking either. No one was stopping her. No one was saying, "Wait, let the boy stay." No one was asking if there had been a mistake. No one was asking anything at all. He stood, his legs stiff, his mouth dry. The walk down the aisle felt longer than it should have, the weight of unseen eyes pressing against his back. By the time he reached economy, the cabin felt different, heavier somehow. A man sitting in the row beside him cleared his throat. "Everything all right, buddy?" His voice was neutral, but the way he looked at Daniel sideways, hesitant, made it clear that he already knew the answer. Daniel forced a nod. "Yeah," he said, but he knew he wasn't fine. The man nodded, turning back to his screen. A few rows ahead, someone was laughing at a sitcom. Someone else was flipping through a magazine. A plastic cup of watered-down soda resting on the tray table. Life moved forward as if nothing had happened. But something had. Daniel stared down at his phone, his fingers hovering over the screen. He didn't want to text his mother. Didn't want to tell her that everything she had taught him about belonging, about standing tall, had just been undone by a single moment. But he typed the words anyway. "Mom, they made me leave my seat." The message sent. The dots appeared. A long pause. Then, finally, the response. "What do you mean they made you leave your seat?" His chest tightened. He typed back, his fingers moving quickly. "The flight attendant said I didn't belong in first class. She made me move." Another pause. Longer this time. Then 3 words, sharp and precise. "What's the flight number?" Daniel's breath hitched. He checked his boarding pass. His hands still trembling. He typed the number back as quickly as he could. The response came almost instantly. "Stay where you are. Don't worry about anything." Daniel let out a slow breath. But it didn't help. Because the thing about his mother was that she never yelled. She never had to. And something told him that Evelyn Harper had just made the biggest mistake of her life. The hum of the airplane engines was steady. A low vibration that filled the cabin like the pulse of something alive. But for Daniel Walker, 10 years old and suddenly too aware of the world around him, everything had shifted. He sat in the economy seat, his fingers curled around his phone, rereading his mother's last message. "Stay where you are. Don't worry about anything." That should have made him feel safe. Should have settled something deep in his chest. But it didn't. Because even at 10 years old, Daniel understood that words weren't shields. They couldn't protect him from the stares that still burned the back of his neck. From the knowledge that no one, not a single person, had stood up when they watched him get forced out of his seat. He tightened his grip on his phone. The flight attendant had spoken so easily, so confidently, as if she had been making a correction, not a mistake, like she knew no one would question her. Because they didn't. Across the aisle, an older woman flipped through a magazine. She had been sitting in first class. He had seen her when he boarded, had caught a glimpse of her carefully styled white hair, her pearl earrings, the way she didn't even look up when Evelyn Harper pulled him from his seat. Now, she finally glanced at him. Just for a second. Then she turned the page. Daniel felt his stomach twist. This was how it worked, wasn't it? Not with shouts. Not with outright cruelty. No, this was something else. This was the weight of silence. This was the permission in people's averted gazes. His phone buzzed. "Mom, what did she say to you exactly?" He hesitated, not because he didn't know what to say, but because he wasn't sure how to explain something that had been left unsaid. "She said there was a mistake. That I didn't belong in first class." His thumb hovered over the screen. Then he added, "She didn't even check my ticket." This time, there was no pause. The response came immediately. "Who was the flight attendant?" Daniel glanced toward the front of the plane. He could still see her. Evelyn Harper. She was moving through first class now, refilling drinks, smoothing out napkins. She didn't look rushed, didn't look guilty. She looked comfortable, like nothing had happened. Daniel took a breath and typed her name. Then, almost as if she could feel him watching, Evelyn turned. For just a second, their eyes met, and Daniel saw it. Not regret, not guilt, just annoyance. The way someone looks at a fly they've already swatted but somehow it's still buzzing. Then she looked away, and Daniel felt something settle deep in his chest, something hard. Something that made his fingers grip the phone a little tighter. The shift in power. 15 minutes passed, maybe 20. The plane had leveled off, and passengers had begun to relax, settling into their books, their movies, their overpriced cocktails. And then, the intercom crackled. "Flight attendant Evelyn Harper, please report to the cockpit immediately." The cabin stilled. It wasn't normal for a flight attendant to be called to the cockpit mid-flight. Not like this, not so directly. Daniel exhaled slowly. His mother was moving. From his seat, he could see Evelyn pause in the first-class aisle, one hand gripping the back of a chair. She hesitated just a moment too long before composing herself, smoothing down her uniform like she could iron out whatever was happening. Then she disappeared through the curtain. The energy in the cabin changed. Passengers exchanged quick glances. Whispers rippled, subtle but present. They didn't know what was happening. Not yet, but they could feel it. Daniel sat back. He didn't smile. Not yet, but for the first time since stepping on this plane, he didn't feel so small. The reckoning. Evelyn Harper stepped into the cockpit, her stomach tightening with something she couldn't name. Captain Richard Reeves was sitting in his chair, one hand resting on the controls. But he wasn't alone. His co-pilot was there, silent, unreadable. And on the small in-flight communication screen, a video call was open. Naomi Walker. Evelyn knew her face immediately. Not because she had ever met her before, but because Naomi Walker was the kind of woman you recognized even if you didn't know why. She wasn't just a CEO. She was power incarnate, and she was looking directly at Evelyn. "Miss Harper," Naomi said, voice even, controlled, "do you want to explain why my son was removed from his seat?" Evelyn's throat went dry. She glanced at the captain, but his face gave nothing away. He wasn't here to save her. "Ma'am, Naomi cut her off. "Did you check his ticket?" Evelyn hesitated. She could feel it, the way the space around her had shrunk. How suddenly. She was the one being examined, judged. "Miss Harper," Naomi repeated, "did you check my son's ticket before you told him to move?" Evelyn swallowed hard. "No." Silence. Then the captain sighed, shaking his head. Naomi's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "You looked at a 10-year-old black boy in first class and decided he didn't belong there. You didn't verify his information. You didn't check the system. You made an assumption." Evelyn felt heat rise up her neck. I thought. "I don't care what you thought." Naomi's voice sliced through the space like a blade. "I care about what you did." The captain leaned forward. "Miss Harper, per corporate orders, you will personally escort Daniel Walker back to his original seat." His voice was firm, devoid of sympathy. "And you will apologize." Evelyn's stomach twisted. "Sir," she started, voice lower now, desperate. "Maybe we can." That wasn't a request. The captain's voice left no room for argument. Evelyn's hands clenched at her sides. She had spent years commanding respect, years ensuring that when she walked through the cabin, people listened. And now, she was about to walk the length of the plane and return a boy to the seat she had taken from him. She was about to undo herself. And there wasn't a damn thing she could do about it. The walk of shame. The first-class passengers were silent when she emerged from the cockpit. Evelyn's heart pounded as she moved down the aisle, feeling the weight of every set of eyes on her. Daniel was waiting. He didn't look triumphant. He didn't smirk. He just looked at her. Steady. Watching. Evelyn cleared her throat. "Mr. Walker," she said, forcing the words out. "There was a misunderstanding. I'd like to escort you back to your original seat." Daniel tilted his head slightly. Why was it a misunderstanding? Evelyn stiffened. She hadn't expected him to push back. She opened her mouth, closed it. "I should have checked your ticket," she admitted. "I apologize." The words tasted bitter. Daniel studied her, then without another word stood, hoisting his backpack over his shoulder. As he followed Evelyn through the cabin, past rows of passengers who had seen everything but said nothing, he knew one thing. This time, it wasn't just him who felt small. Evelyn Harper did, too. The return to first class should have felt like a victory. But it didn't. Daniel Walker slid back into the wide leather seat, feeling the softness beneath him, the space around him. Everything was exactly as it had been before. The seat hadn't changed. The cabin hadn't changed. The same glasses clinked softly against the tray tables. The same hushed voices murmured over the hum of the engines. And yet, everything was different. Because now, people were looking. Not directly. No, never directly. But he could feel it. The quiet, the stolen glances, the shifting bodies as though a ripple had disturbed the smooth surface of their world. Daniel didn't look at Evelyn Harper as she stood stiffly beside him. Her hands clasped in front of her, her jaw tight. She had done what she was ordered to do, walked him back down the aisle. Forced an apology past her lips, spoken in a voice that had been drained of its usual crisp authority. But she had not changed. She was humiliated, yes, but humbling was something different. He knew that now. She lingered a second too long, like she wanted to say something else, something to regain control, to smooth over the sharp edges of what had just happened. But there was nothing left to say. She turned sharply and walked away. And as she did, Daniel exhaled, slow and steady, pressing his back against the seat. The turbulence wasn't outside. It wasn't in the sky. It was right here, in this cabin, in the invisible but unmistakable shift of power. And everyone felt it. The air changes. Across the aisle, a man in a pressed navy suit glanced at Daniel, then quickly looked away. A woman a few seats ahead adjusted her scarf. Not because she needed to, but because it gave her hands something to do. A businessman scrolled through his phone, his jaw tight, his eyes flickering upward every few seconds. This wasn't the easy silence they were used to. This was a silence laced with something heavier, something dangerous. Guilt, shame, complicity. They had all seen it happen. They had all let it happen. Daniel didn't move. He let them sit with it. Let the discomfort settle into their bones the way it had settled into his when Evelyn Harper first pulled him from his seat. He knew now that his presence here was an act of defiance. That his existence in this space was not neutral. It was a challenge. The rules had never been written for someone like him. He was supposed to be invisible. Supposed to be elsewhere. Not because of anything he had done, but because of what he was. And that, more than anything, was what had shaken Evelyn Harper. She had been certain. That was the thing. She hadn't second-guessed herself. She had looked at him and known. Or so she thought. And now? Now, she was sitting in the galley at the front of the plane. Her hands gripping the edge of the counter. Her mind spinning. Her face burning with a shame she wasn't ready to name. For the first time in her career, she wasn't the one in control. And it was killing her. The gathering storm. Back in the terminal. Thousands of miles away. Naomi Walker paced her office. Her phone pressed to her ear. "What's the status?" she asked. Her voice calm, precise. Her assistant, James, cleared his throat on the other end. "Miss Harper has returned Daniel to his seat." The captain confirmed she issued an apology. Naomi smiled, but it wasn't warm. She didn't mean it. James hesitated. "No." Naomi exhaled through her nose, her mind already moving 5 steps ahead. "The passengers? They saw everything." "Good." A pause. "Social media?" James sighed. "There's already footage circulating. Someone recorded it. It's picking up traction." Naomi's lips pressed together. Of course they did. People only cared when they had proof. She had spent a lifetime proving herself. Climbing, fighting, earning what had been handed to so many others without question. She was used to it. But she had never thought that her son would have to fight that same fight at 10 years old. That was the part that burned. She had fought her way into boardrooms, into executive lounges, into power. She had forced them to see her, forced them to acknowledge her. And yet, none of that had stopped this from happening. Because to Evelyn Harper, Daniel wasn't Naomi Walker's son. He was just another black boy in the wrong seat. And that was unforgivable. Naomi's jaw tightened. "Contact corporate." James paused. "Are you sure?" "Tell them," she said, voice like steel, "that when that plane lands, Evelyn Harper will be met at the gate. And she will not be walking out of that airport as an employee." Silence. Then James inhaled. Understood. Naomi ended the call. Then she sat, folded her hands, and waited. The final descent. 30 minutes before landing, the tension in the cabin had solidified into something unspoken but undeniable. The flight attendants moved differently. Not just Evelyn Harper, all of them. They were more careful now. More measured. Because now, they knew they were being watched. Daniel noticed the shift. One of the attendants, a younger woman with nervous hands and a tight smile, approached him cautiously. "Mr. Walker," she said, her voice quiet. "Can I get you anything?" Daniel studied her. He had been sitting in this seat for over an hour now. No one had asked him that before. He glanced at his drink. Still half full. "No," he said simply. "I'm fine." She nodded quickly and stepped away. As if relieved, Daniel turned his head, looking out the window. Below them, the city sprawled in neat grids, the streets stretching toward the horizon, glowing with the slow burn of early evening. The world looked peaceful from up here. But Daniel knew better. He could feel it in his bones. Something was coming. A reckoning. And Evelyn Harper was about to walk straight into it. The plane touched down with a jolt, tires screaming softly against the runway. The familiar symphony of landing unfolded, the gentle hum of the engines powering down, the overhead bins clicking open, the low murmur of passengers preparing to leave behind this shared space of air and silence. But not for Evelyn Harper. She sat in the galley, her hands gripping the armrests of the jump seat, her pulse hammering in her ears. The plane was on the ground, but she wasn't safe. She could feel it. Something had shifted. She had spent years enforcing rules, dictating order in the quiet ways that people in power never had to name out loud. She knew the rhythm of control, how it moved, how it settled, how it was never challenged unless you let it be. But now, that balance had tipped, and she knew, deep in her bones, that once she stepped off this plane, there would be consequences waiting for her on the other side of that door. The walk of shame. Ladies and gentlemen, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. Welcome to New York. Please remain seated until we reach the gate. A chorus of clicks echoed through the cabin as seat belts were released prematurely. Passengers already leaning forward, impatient, ready to move on, to return to their real lives. Daniel Walker sat still. He wasn't in a rush. He had nothing to run from. His hands rested on the armrests. His posture relaxed, but his eyes were sharp, watching. The air in the cabin had changed. No one was speaking to him, but no one was ignoring him either. A businessman across the aisle shifted uncomfortably, his phone held in his hand. Screen dim. He had seen what had happened. They all had. And now, for the first time, the weight of their silence sat with them. Undeniable. Inescapable. A flight attendant, Lisa, the younger one who had questioned Evelyn, hesitated near the galley, her gaze flickering between Daniel and the front of the plane. She knew what was about to happen. They all did. And then, the final blow. The intercom crackled again, but this time, it wasn't the captain's voice. It was the gate agent. Miss Evelyn Harper. The voice rang through the speakers. Crisp. Professional. Please report to the jet bridge immediately. Silence. Then a ripple. Passengers exchanged glances. The murmur returned, hushed but electric. Daniel didn't move, but he smiled. The moment of truth. Evelyn Harper had always walked with purpose. She had always moved with the confidence of someone who belonged. But now, as she stepped into the aisle, she felt the weight of every gaze on her, felt the shift in the air, the slow unraveling of the authority she had worn like armor. She moved stiffly, mechanically, past first-class passengers who suddenly seemed fascinated by their own lapels, their luggage, their armrests. No one looked at her. No one spoke, but she felt it, their collective knowledge. Their unwillingness to stand beside her now that the tide had turned. And at the center of it all, Daniel Walker. He was watching her, not with anger, not even with triumph, just with quiet certainty, the kind that couldn't be shaken. Not by words, not by uniforms, not by anything. He had won, and they both knew it. The gate, the doors opened. Bright artificial light spilled into the cabin as the jet bridge connected. As the world outside came rushing in, Evelyn stepped through first, and there they were, waiting. A man in a dark suit. Crisp and deliberate, corporate. He had the look of someone who had been sent not to argue, but to conclude. Next to him, an airport security officer. Behind them, 2 members of the airline's HR department. And then, at the center of it all, Naomi Walker. She stood perfectly still, arms crossed, eyes sharp and unreadable. She did not move, did not step forward. She didn't have to. The message was clear. Evelyn's stomach twisted. She had always believed in rules, in systems, in the structure that kept people in their places. She had built her authority within that system, had prided herself on knowing how things worked, on enforcing how things worked. And now, that very system was swallowing her whole. She had underestimated something. She had assumed Daniel Walker was just a boy. She had forgotten who his mother was. Naomi Walker nodded once to the man in the suit. He stepped forward, clearing his throat. Miss Harper, he said, his voice neutral but firm. Please come with us. She hesitated, but there was nothing left to say. Nothing left to do. She stepped forward. And just like that, the door shut behind her. The lesson. Daniel Walker took his time exiting the plane. By the time he stepped into the terminal, most passengers had already moved on, lost in their own worlds, their own itineraries. But his mother was waiting. Naomi stood near the windows, hands in the pockets of her sleek black coat, watching the lights of the tarmac outside. She didn't turn when he approached. "You okay?" she asked. Daniel nodded. "Yeah." She studied him for a moment, then exhaled, slow and measured. "They fired her." Daniel looked up. "I know." She tilted her head slightly. "How do you feel about that?" Daniel thought about it, thought about how small he had felt, how invisible, how quickly a person could decide that you didn't belong. But he also thought about this moment, about now. He thought about the way she had to walk past every single person who had let it happen to him. The way they had all seen her fall. The way silence had cost her everything. He met his mother's gaze. "I feel," he said, "like she finally understands what it feels like." Naomi Walker nodded slowly. And together, they walked away. Some lessons come easy, some come hard. For Evelyn Harper, the lesson had come at 35,000 feet. And by the time she realized it, it was already too late. The city swallowed them whole the moment they stepped out of the airport. The night air was thick, humming with the constant rhythm of a world that never stopped moving. Cars streaked by, headlights slicing through the dark, the scent of rain still lingering from an earlier storm. Naomi Walker walked with purpose, her heels clicking against the pavement, her hand resting lightly on Daniel's shoulder. She wasn't rushing, but she wasn't lingering either. There was no need. The battle had been fought. The war, however, was just beginning. They reached the car, sleek and waiting at the curb. The driver nodded at Naomi, his hands tight around the wheel, his gaze flickering toward Daniel as the boys slid into the backseat. Daniel sank into the leather, exhaling slowly as the city blurred past. His mother's phone buzzed. Again. She ignored it. Instead, she turned to him. "Are you hungry?" Daniel shook his head. He wasn't sure what he was. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind something heavy, something that sat in his chest like an unanswered question. She studied him for a moment, then nodded, as if she understood. And of course, she did, because she had been here before. Different circumstances, same story, different names, same fight, a story too familiar. Across town, in a dimly lit apartment that now felt unbearably small, Evelyn Harper sat in the silence of her own making. She had spent the ride home in a daze, barely remembering how she got here. Her uniform still clung to her, suffocating now, the fabric a cruel reminder of everything she had once believed to be true. She had been fired, dismissed, escorted out like a criminal. And for what? A misunderstanding? A moment of poor judgment? Or was it something deeper? She pressed her hands against her temples, her breath uneven. Her phone buzzed again. The texts had been rolling in since the news broke. Some from colleagues, cautious, distant. Some from friends, confused, trying to understand how someone like her had ended up like this. And then, the others. "You got what you deserved. I hope you never work again. Racist B." She stopped reading. Her hands trembled as she set the phone down. This wasn't supposed to happen to her. She had followed the rules. She had kept order. She had done what she had always done, what had always been expected of her. And now, she was the one they were turning on. The world had flipped, and she had no footing left. The ripple effect. Meanwhile, Daniel Walker was about to learn something about the world, something his mother had spent years trying to prepare him for. His name was everywhere. He didn't know it yet. But by the time he would wake up the next morning, it would already be out of his control. The video had been posted. The moment Evelyn Harper had pulled him from his seat. The words she had used. The way no one had spoken up. The way she had been forced to walk him back. People had seen it, and they were talking. It had started small, a single tweet. A grainy video from a passenger who hadn't spoken at the time but felt brave enough now. But the thing about injustice is that people recognize it when they see it. And once they see it, they cannot unsee it. By midnight, the news stations had picked it up. By morning, it would be a headline. And by the end of the day, Daniel Walker would no longer just be a boy who was removed from first class. He would be a movement. The unraveling, Evelyn's name hadn't been released yet. But it would be. She could feel it. She could feel it in the way the world had turned against her. The way the silence in her apartment felt like a living thing. Creeping into the corners. Pressing against her chest. She wanted to scream. She wanted to argue. To defend herself. To say that it wasn't about race. That she hadn't meant anything by it. But the truth sat like a stone in her throat. Because she had meant something by it. She had seen that boy in first class and had known. Or at least, she had thought she had known. And now? Now, it was her face that would be frozen in a moment of shame. Captured in a frame. Judged by strangers who had never met her. Who would never give her the chance to explain herself. But had she given Daniel that chance? Had she ever stopped to question her own certainty? She closed her eyes. What have I done? The question that never leaves. Daniel lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his phone buzzing on the nightstand. He hadn't touched it since they got home. He already knew what it would say. The world had noticed. His mother had told him. Long ago. That power was not about how loud you spoke or how much money you had. It was about who listened when you spoke. And now, people were listening. For the first time in his life. He wasn't invisible. And that was a different kind of power. But it was also something else. It was responsibility. Because now, people were asking a question. Not about Evelyn Harper. Not about his mother. Not even about the airline. But about how many times this had happened before. How many times had people like her made decisions like that? How many times had a child, a man, a woman, been told, you don't belong here and the world had moved on? How many times had silence won? Not this time. Not this time. Daniel closed his eyes. He didn't know what came next. But he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. Not even close. The world does not wait. Not for reflection. Not for regret. Not for the slow, measured process of reckoning. The morning came sharp and relentless. Carving through the silence like a knife. By the time Daniel opened his eyes, the world already knew his name. His mother was standing by the window. Her phone pressed against her ear. Her shoulders tense in a way he had never seen before. Sunlight bled through the glass, streaking across her face, making her look untouchable like a woman who had built herself in the fire of battles no one had seen. She turned when she heard him shift. You should get dressed, she said. Daniel sat up. He knew what that tone meant. Something was coming. A name no longer his own. His phone was still buzzing, vibrating against the nightstand with a frequency that made his stomach tighten. He reached for it, hesitant, his fingers slow. He shouldn't have looked. CEO's son removed from first-class racial bias or policy. This is what black children still face in America. Airline apologizes after backlash, but is it enough? Thousands of comments, thousands of opinions. His face was everywhere. A video of the moment Evelyn Harper had told him to move. His quiet walk down the aisle. The way he had stood. Small but steady. As she returned to take him back. People were furious. People were inspired. People were tearing each other apart. Daniel felt the weight of it press against his chest. This wasn't just about him anymore. It wasn't even about Evelyn Harper. It was about all the other times it had happened. The times that hadn't been recorded. Hadn't gone viral. The times where no one had fought back. And now, people were fighting. But for how long? And at what cost? The pressure of power. Daniel. His mother's voice pulled him from the screen. She had moved to the table, pouring herself a cup of coffee. She gestured for him to sit across from her. He did. Naomi Walker studied her son. Not like a mother. Like a strategist. Like a woman who had learned how to measure a room before she stepped inside it. You know what happens next, don't you? Daniel swallowed. He wasn't sure. She set her phone down. They want to talk to you. Daniel blinked. Who? The media. The network anchors. The activists. The politicians who suddenly care. The airline executives who want to clean up their mess. She sipped her coffee. They all want a piece of this. Daniel looked down at his hands. He was 10 years old. Just yesterday, he had been a boy who wanted to watch a movie before takeoff. Now, he was something else. Something bigger than himself. Something dangerous. Naomi leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. Do you want to say something? Daniel hesitated. Did he? Would it change anything? Would the people who had been silent on that plane suddenly find their voices? Or would they just move on? People will forget, he said, more to himself than to her. His mother exhaled. Some will. She didn't sugarcoat it. She never did. But some won't. She continued. And the question is, what do you want them to remember? The other side of the story. Evelyn Harper had always been the kind of woman who knew how to move forward. When her father lost his job, she moved forward. When her first marriage fell apart, she moved forward. When she learned to survive in an industry that rewarded compliance over compassion, she moved forward. But now, she was stuck. The headlines weren't just about the airline anymore. They were about her. Her name had been leaked. Her face was on the screen. Frozen in time. Captured mid-sentence. Mid-decision. Mid-destruction. Fired flight attendant speaks out. I didn't mean any harm. Evelyn Harper faces public backlash after viral incident. Her inbox was flooded. Some messages were from people she had worked with, quiet, unsure, waiting to see how this would unfold before deciding whether they still wanted to be associated with her. Others were cruel. You deserved worse. We see you. We won't forget. Evelyn closed her laptop, her hands shaking. She had spent her whole life believing in the rules, believing that they protected her, that if she followed them, if she upheld them, they would shield her from scrutiny. But now, she was seeing them for what they really were. Rules had never been designed to protect people like Daniel Walker. They had been designed to contain him. And now that the world had watched her enforce those rules, she was discovering something else. Rules didn't protect her, either. Not anymore. The choice that changed everything. The car ride to the studio was silent. Daniel sat in the backseat, his mother beside him, his fingers curled against his lap. This was his choice. No one had forced him to speak. No one had told him what to say. But he had seen the way the world had shifted in the past 24 hours. And he knew, with a certainty that was both thrilling and terrifying, that his voice mattered. He wasn't just telling his story. He was speaking for all the people who had never been given the chance to tell their own. The driver pulled to a stop outside the building. Camera crews were already waiting. Naomi turned to him. Last chance. You don't have to do this. Daniel met her gaze. And for the first time since stepping onto that plane, he knew exactly where he belonged. I'm ready. And with that, Daniel Walker stepped out of the car. And into history. The cameras were ready. The lights had been adjusted. Their glow softened just enough to make the moment feel less manufactured. Though everyone in the room knew this was a performance, one where every word, every pause, every flicker of expression would be scrutinized. Daniel Walker sat in the chair across from the interviewer, his feet barely touching the floor. He was wearing a crisp button-up shirt, his hair neatly brushed, his hands folded in his lap. He had been told to relax, to just speak his truth. But the weight of the moment pressed against him, invisible but undeniable. He wasn't here because he had asked to be. He was here because the world had demanded it. The interviewer, a woman with polished features and the kind of smile that had been perfected for television, adjusted in her chair. The cameras rolled. The room fell into silence. And then, the first question. Daniel, can you tell us, in your own words, what happened on that flight? Daniel took a breath. He had already gone over this in his mind, played it back like a film he hadn't chosen to watch. And yet, saying it aloud was different. When I got on the plane, I sat in my seat. He began, his voice steady but soft. I had checked my ticket. I knew where I was supposed to be. A pause. And then she came. The interviewer leaned in. The flight attendant? Yes. Daniel looked past the cameras for a moment, as if searching for something just beyond their reach. She asked where my parents were. I told her I was flying alone. She didn't believe me. Another pause. She didn't even check my ticket. She just told me to move. The words hung in the air. The interviewer nodded, her expression neutral, measured. Do you think it was because of your race? Daniel hesitated, not because he didn't know the answer, but because he knew that whatever he said next would shape the conversation in ways he couldn't control. So he chose his words carefully. I think, he said, slowly, that she looked at me and decided I didn't belong. A shift in the room. Not loud, not dramatic, but a shift nonetheless. Because this wasn't just about one flight. This was about every time a black child had been told they were in the wrong place. Every time a black man had been questioned for walking into a building too nice, a neighborhood too quiet, a store too expensive. Every time a black woman had been dismissed, underestimated, ignored. Daniel was 10, but he had already learned what it meant to be seen as a threat. The interviewer let his words settle before leaning in. Daniel, there are some people who say this was a misunderstanding. That the flight attendant was just doing her job. What would you say to them? Daniel didn't blink. I'd ask them why she didn't question anyone else in first class. The room tightened. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't even raising his voice. But the truth, when spoken plainly, didn't need volume to be deafening. The interviewer shifted. This was the moment the one producers loved. The one that would be clipped and replayed across screens and timelines for days. But Daniel wasn't performing. He was just telling the truth. The other side of the story. Miles away, Evelyn Harper sat on the edge of her bed, watching the interview unfold in real time. The screen cast a harsh glow against the walls of her small apartment, highlighting the exhaustion in her features, the tightness in her jaw. She had barely left her home since the incident. Her phone had rung 100 times. Reporters, former colleagues, strangers who wanted to remind her of exactly what they thought of her. But this was the first time she was hearing him speak. And as she listened, she felt something unexpected, something unfamiliar and unwelcome. A weight, not of guilt, but of recognition. She had told herself 100 times that this wasn't about race. That it had been a simple mistake. A judgment call, nothing more. But hearing the boy's voice, seeing his face, she understood something she hadn't allowed herself to admit before. She had never questioned herself. Not once. Not when she told him to move. Not when she dismissed his protest. Not when she turned her back and walked away, convinced she had done the right thing. She had been so sure. And now? Now, she wasn't sure of anything. The question that remains. Back in the studio, the interview was nearing its end. The interviewer leaned forward, her voice gentle. Daniel, what do you hope comes out of all this? Daniel thought about it. For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine a world where this hadn't happened. A world where he had taken his seat and no one had questioned him. A world where Evelyn Harper had seen him not as a problem to be corrected, but as a child. A world where he hadn't needed to be brave. But that world didn't exist. Not yet. So he met the interviewer's gaze and said, simply, I just want people to speak up next time. No outrage, no grand speech, just a simple, impossible request. See us, speak up, because silence was the real enemy. And it always had been. The interview ended, but the world did not. Daniel Walker stepped off the stage, away from the cameras, back into the hum of reality. But something had changed. He could feel it in the way the producers whispered as he passed. In the way the assistants glanced at him. In the way even the makeup artist who had barely spoken to him before now looked at him like he had done something extraordinary. But all he had done was speak. And yet, people were treating him like he had unlocked something. His mother was waiting for him in the hallway. Arms crossed. Unreadable. You did well, she said. He exhaled. Did I? Her lips pressed together in thought. You were honest. Daniel nodded, but a weight settled on his shoulders. Honesty didn't change the world overnight. It didn't erase what had happened. And it wouldn't stop it from happening again. The aftermath. The interview aired that night. The internet caught fire. A 10-year-old shouldn't have to teach us this. The next generation won't be silent. The question that left everyone speechless. Some called him brave. Some called him a troublemaker. Some predictably called him a liar. But no one ignored him. And that was its own kind of power. The airline released a second statement. More formal, more desperate, more aware that they were now on trial. Policies were reviewed. New training sessions were announced. Executives made promises about doing better. About listening. About ensuring that this would never happen again. But Daniel had learned something about promises. They were easy to break. Because people were only outraged until they weren't. Until the next headline came. Until the next injustice demanded attention. Until the world moved on. And the only ones left carrying the weight of it were the ones it had actually happened to. The woman who had to watch it burn. Evelyn Harper stayed inside for 3 days. 3 days of phone calls she didn't answer. 3 days of emails she didn't open. 3 days of staring at her reflection. Trying to recognize the woman she had been before her name became synonymous with failure. The network had reached out for a statement. She hadn't given one. What could she say? That she was sorry? That she hadn't meant it? That she had only done what she thought was right at the time? That she had never thought of herself as racist? She had tried to tell herself that once, repeating it like a mantra, like a shield against the truth pressing down on her. But every time she looked at the footage of that moment, every time she heard the words she had spoken so easily, she knew. She hadn't questioned it. And that more than anything was the crime. A meeting that wasn't planned. Naomi Walker had no intention of seeing Evelyn Harper again. She had buried that chapter. Left it in the hands of corporate executives. Let them handle the details of her termination, her suspension, her fall. But one evening, nearly a week after the interview, her phone buzzed with a message from her assistant. Evelyn Harper requested a meeting. Naomi stared at the screen. For a long time, she didn't answer. And then, finally, set it up. The final conversation. They met in a quiet cafe. The kind of place people went to disappear for an hour or two. Evelyn looked smaller in person. Not physically, but in the way she held herself now. In the way her shoulders no longer squared with certainty. In the way her fingers trembled slightly around her cup. Naomi sat across from her. Waiting. Evelyn swallowed. I didn't come here to ask for anything, she said finally. I wanted to see you. To say something. Naomi folded her hands on the table. Go on. Evelyn exhaled shakily. I was wrong. She looked down at the table, as if ashamed to meet Naomi's gaze. I don't know if I even understood it before. Not really. But I do now. And I know that doesn't fix anything. I know it doesn't change what I did. She hesitated, then forced herself to look up. But I wanted to say it anyway. Naomi studied her, unmoving. There was no satisfaction in this. No victory. The truth was, Naomi had spent her entire career encountering people like Evelyn Harper. People who smiled in meetings but never quite saw her. People who followed rules that had never been questioned, because they had never been made to question them. She had spent her whole life navigating a world that hadn't been built for her. And now, her son had too. She should have been furious. But she wasn't. She was just tired. Naomi sighed, leaning back in her chair. What do you want from me? Evelyn blinked. Nothing. I don't expect forgiveness. Naomi tilted her head. Then why are you here? Evelyn opened her mouth, closed it, because she didn't know. Because maybe, for the first time in her life, she wasn't sure what came next. And maybe, that was the beginning of something. Or maybe, it was just too late. Naomi finished her coffee, set the cup down. Then she stood. Evelyn didn't stop her, didn't ask for anything more. She just watched as Naomi Walker walked away. Because that was the thing about mistakes. You could apologize for them. You could try to make peace with them. But you couldn't undo them. And sometimes, that was the real punishment. What remains? Daniel never saw Evelyn Harper again. He never needed to. The world moved on just as he knew it would. The news cycle found another headline. People stopped talking about him. And yet, something had changed. Because for the rest of his life, whenever he stepped into a room, whenever he took a seat somewhere he had every right to be, he would remember the way silence had nearly erased him, and the way his voice had saved him. And that would never be forgotten.